Hello, my name is Jenniffer Taylor and I am the author of Your Skirt Your Way and Girl with a Sewing Machine. I'm really excited to be taking part today and sharing with you some of my Your Skirt Your Way tips. So first up for my Your Skirt Your Way tips is how to get the perfect corners on your patch pockets, and I hope this tip is something that you find very useful. So for my first Your Skirt Your Way tip, I get asked a lot about how do you get nice crisp pocket edges. So what I'm talking about here is the opening of a pocket. So here's one of my samples. So basically this section here where I'm going to be popping my hand in, obviously you can see it's got a nice right angle on both sides, and it's how do I get that nice and super crisp and also secure, because obviously your hands are going to be going in and out of that pocket quite a lot, especially if you use pockets as much as I do. So this is my tip for you on that. So imagine that this piece of fabric here is my pocket and the blue fabric behind me is the garment itself. So we won't need that bit for a second. So just focusing on the pocket. What you're going to need to do, I would recommend getting a piece of interfacing. So you would need to create a kind of hem at the top of the pocket so you get that nice clean finish. So it's that area that we're going to be interfacing. So what I'm going to do, you've got one side that's got a fusible glue and the other side hasn't, so make sure you're using the right side, like so. And I'm going to fuse that down first of all. Just adding a little bit of interfacing to the top of that pocket hem, if you like, or pocket opening, just helps provide that structure and support when you're stitching that pocket onto your garment. So there it is, it's fused. So a tip with interfacing is just make sure that's completely cooled down before you start handling the fabric again. But I'm pushed for time, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. But obviously at home you need to wait for that. So the first thing you need to do, a lot of people tend to then fold that under and then attempt to sort of tuck in the remaining seam allowances. But you can see that that leaves the potential then, if I just fold that over for a second, of this kind of taggy bit, so you can see that when you start stitching it down. So I'm going to show you a tip to kind of make that a little bit hidden. So what you're going to do is fold back to where your interfacing is. So that would be your hem depth. So I'm just doing another little press here. And then what you then need to do is just tuck under a little bit of a seam allowance. So it's not much here, it's probably just shy of 1 centimetre. But don't worry about it because you're not going to see that part. And again, I'm just going to quickly fold and I'm going to press that down like so. Okay, so now it's just about stitching these down. So going to your sewing machine, what you're going to do is stitch down these two edges using your seam allowance. So in this case it's a 1.5, but obviously depending on what you prefer drafting with, that may differ. And you're going to start at the top, do a little back stitch just to secure that, and then you're going to stitch just past where that fold is, like so. And then you're going to repeat that on the other side. Back stitch, making sure you've gone past that little tab, and back stitch again. So once you've got those two edges stitched down, you're now ready for the next step. So what I like to do here, a lot of people are inclined to kind of cut or trim these sections down, whereas I actually like to leave them quite full. So when it comes to stitching onto your garment, you really have something quite substantial to anchor onto. If this is a particularly thick fabric, I don't know, something with a bit of texture, maybe like a corduroy for instance, then I would suggest trimming down because it would be very thick. But a lightweight cotton like this, which is quite thin, quite delicate, you really do need that extra bit of support, so I would leave it in. So if you are trimming, then what I would do is come into a corner like that. So you can see I'm quite close to the edge, whereas if it's an okay thinner fabric, I would leave it like that. But either way, whatever you decide to do, you're now going to tuck that under, and this is where your next tool, handy tool, comes in. So this is just a standard chopstick. Obviously you can get stilettos or turner outs to do this step, but if you don't have one of those, go to your kitchen. I'm sure you've got one of these lying around somewhere, and I'm using that to kind of poke the corners out. So once you've done that, what you can then do is do another final press. You can see that's already starting to tuck in my seam allowances for the remainder of the pocket edges, like so. So you can see that's starting to come to shape. So the only thing we have to do now is just stitch this edge down just so that it's more secure. And again, depending on whether you are a beginner stitcher or a more experienced stitcher, it would depend on which way you would do it. So there's nothing wrong with you stitching this way round if you prefer. But if you're using, let's say, a top stitching thread because you're doing a denim skirt, for instance, and obviously it's a thicker, more bolder top stitching thread, then you would need to stitch this way. But just be mindful of what your the gauge is, what the seam allowance is. Popping that in and then stitching it down like so. So I like to leave some tails here, because what you can then do is take a needle and thread and thread this into this enclosed section here, so it gives you a nice clean finish, rather than leaving the tails short like this side, which means you haven't really got much to play with and you'd have to cut those off, which always leads to the potential of unraveling in that section. So my preferred method would be to take a needle and thread those back through that enclosed section at the top of the pocket. But as you can see, that's giving us a nice pointed corner and a structured edge as well. So that's what that would look like. For my next Your Skirt Your Way tip, I'm focusing on curved bottoms. Now, just to clarify, I am talking about pocket curved bottoms. And what I find is that a lot of people ask me, how do I get that perfect curve? So I'm hoping this tip will not only help you with your curved bottom pockets, but also your square bottoms as well. Okay then, so for my first Your Skirt Your Way tip would be all about pockets, in particular when we're talking about patch pockets, or in this case a patch pocket that has a curved bottom. Now what tends to happen is when you have a curved bottom like this, then when you're tucking under your seam allowances to then top stitch it down, you end up with this kind of hexagonal kind of awkward finishing on the curve. So I'm going to show you a quick tip now on how to help that from happening. So first of all, what I would suggest you do is change your bobbin thread. So it doesn't really matter what colour thread you use, this initial stitch is going to come out anyway. So as you can see here, I've got a grey thread in the bottom and I've got a purple thread in the top. So mainly so you can see what I'm doing, but like I said, these threads are going to come out anyway. So if you have any bobbins with little bits of leftover thread on, this is perfect. The next thing you're going to need to do on your machine is take your the stitch length, sorry, you need to increase that to the biggest the machine will give you. So in my case, it's 5.0, so that's actually a 5mm stitch, so that's exactly what we need. The next thing we're going to do is put in a line of stitching where the seam allowance is. So it would be, in this case, it's 1.5, but obviously it depends on what you prefer to use. And we're going to stitch around the length and the bottom of the pocket using that 1.5 seam allowance. So making sure that we have tails. And what I mean by tails is this excess thread here. Sometimes with automatic cutting on the machine, you tend to lose your tails. So just make sure you have those available to you before we start. And then we're ready to go. So I'm just going to do a quick line of stitching going down the length of the pocket. Now I'm starting to hit the curve. So it's a good idea to start pivoting. So what I mean by that is you would stop with the needle down into the fabric, lift the presser foot and then adjust before carrying on. Go around again. So we're round to the other corner now. There we go. And now we're on the home straight. Like so. So again, same as before, this time with the needle up, giving yourself some nice tails, and try not to use your automatic thread cutter on your machine. And now you have a line of stitching on your pocket, which gives you a guideline. So whether you've got a curved or a straight edged pocket, putting in this line of stitching really does help the next step, which is pressing and preparing that pocket to then be put onto the garment itself. So with a straight edge pocket, it's like a square pocket for instance, then what you would do is just use that line to fold your fabric up to the line and give it a press. So obviously you would do that on the 3 sides. Whereas with it being a curved pocket, you need to do something a little bit different, and this is why I asked you to change your bobbin thread. The reason being, sometimes when you're working with, you know, several pockets, you might stitch 2 of them and then forget which way you stitched them. So with the bobbin thread being a different colour, you know which one to pull. So when you pull the thread, the bobbin thread will gather a lot easier than the top thread. So I want to identify what that one is very quickly. So you can see I'm creating these little gathers now, and I'm pushing them towards the curved edge of that pocket. So I'm going to go to the other side now, and again just give it a little pull. You don't need much of a gather, just a little bit to get you started. So now you can see that we've got this curved edge going on. So what that does, so what I then am going to do is take my fingers and push them towards that line of stitching. So what I'm doing here with my left hand is just straightening out that straight edge of the pocket, because these parts don't need to be curved, it's just the very bottom. And then what you can then do is go in with your iron. So I'm going to use the line here to give me a nice straight line, like so. Use the line of stitching to then push towards that curved edge. So again, constantly pushing around. If it's a bit too much, you just need to release the gather a little bit. So I'm just releasing it a bit there. So I'm just releasing a little bit of the gathers there because it's a little bit too much for me. And again, taking my fingers and pushing that line of stitching to the edge. Continuing with my press, so just watch your fingers. Turn that around to make it a little bit easier, and there we have it, like so. If I just turn that around now, one final press. So you notice that I'm not using this ironing action, it's a very still iron with a little bit of steam just to help that process along a little bit, and then to let it cool. But you can see that it's a much nicer curve on the edge of your pocket now. You haven't got that kind of awkward crunch 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 as you go around as you're trying to do it manually. So that gives you a nice curved bottom edge. Once your pocket has cooled completely to the touch, what you can then do is take out that stitching. And again, if you're using the coloured bobbin tip, then in theory you should be able to pull this out without any issues at all, even though it's gathering that up. If I take the other side, like so, pull out the purple thread, and there we have a perfect curved bottom. For my next Your Skirt Your Way tip, I'm talking about a technique that can make or break those pockets. You've probably guessed it already, that's right, it's top stitching. So I'm really hoping this handy little tip will help excel and improve those patch pockets. So for my next Your Skirt Your Way tip, I'm going to be talking about perfect top stitching. And in specifics, I'm talking about top stitching pockets down. So whether you have a squared patch pocket like this, or if you have a curved bottom patch pocket like that one, this tip really does help you out to get that really lovely parallel line of stitching around the edge. As we say, you know, we're all beginners, we all start somewhere, and things like top stitching really does take time to perfect, whereas I'm going to give you a quick cheat method to achieve that super quickly. So on your sewing machine, you probably have a standard foot that looks like this. You probably have an array of feet with your machine, so it's worth having a look in your manual for what is called a blind hem foot, because this is exactly what we're going to be using for our next step. So the reason why I'm using this blind hem foot is because it has this, what I like to call a rudder on the very back. So you can see that little bit there, that little tail, that little black tail. What that's going to do is give me a really nice guide for my fabric, and I'm going to take full advantage of that guide in our next step. So popping the foot back onto the machine, what I'm going to do, as you can see, I've got my round bottomed patch pocket here already and prepared using the other tips that I've showed you earlier, and we're going to secure it on. So obviously you want to pop some pins onto that first. You would have marked out where you want those pockets to be. So I like to put in the pins so the sharp edges are coming out and the pin heads are in the center of the pocket, and you only need a couple really. So I'm just going to go for 4, 1 in each corner, but obviously pin away as many times as you like to make sure that you're comfortable with this next step. There we go. So now we're going to start stitching that pocket down. So taking it to the machine, I've got my pocket on my left and I'm placing the rudder on my right. So what I'm going to do is just move my ironing mat out of the way and bring you closer into what I'm doing here. There we go. So I'm placing the rudder right up towards that pocket edge, and I'm going to turn my needle so it comes down manually rather than just putting my foot down on the gas, as it were. And I'm going to do a little forward and back stitch. And then what I'm going to do is just take it really nice and slowly. So the straight edges are, you know, super nice and easy. And then we're going to start hitting that curve. So this is where the boat really does come into the blind hem foot comes into handle. So I'm using that to pivot, and I'm stopping right where the pocket is. Again, this rudder on the blind hem foot is butting up against that edge of the pocket. So I've constantly got a perfect seam gauge or stitch gauge as I go round. Again, taking it a stitch at a time. You don't need to rush. So whether you have a curved or a square or any shaped pocket, if you've got that tucked under edge, which you will have, this foot will really come into its own. There we go. Just do another little back stitch like so. So there we have it. So if I just take all of the pins out, move my machine out of the way for you, pop my mat back down. You can see once I've moved that little bit of excess thread, which I'll take a needle and probably thread that through again into that enclosed part of that pocket so it's hiding all of those edges rather than cut it. You can see that I've got this really lovely continuous stitch with a parallel top stitching to the curve of the pocket. So you get a really nice top stitch finish there. So that's my tip for top stitching. For my next Your Skirt Your Way tip, I'm talking about a detail that is really quite functional, and without it, especially if you're making something like a pencil skirt, can make or break that skirt. I'm talking about the back vent. I hope my next tutorial will help you along with that process. For my next Your Skirt Your Way tip, I'd like to talk to you about back vents, and I think this is a perfect little detail that you can add into lots of different skirts, but particular this pencil skirt, you just cannot live without that back vent, especially if you're going to go for a really nice sharp looking, what I call wiggle pencil skirt. Think Marilyn Monroe, which is why I've called it the Monroe skirt. So you need this vent to be able to walk in your skirt. So a lot of questions I get asked is, how do I get that nice crisp finish on my back vent? So this is my little mock-up skirt, if you like. So this is the back pieces, the two back pieces that we need to join. So this is the one side, which you can see I've already finished off one of the edges, whereas this side I need to do. So all that is just a simple double hem. So I fold it over once and twice, a very small seam allowance. It's probably no more than 1/4 of an inch really. And I'm going to top stitch that down. Taking that to my machine and running that line of stitching down that edge. So that's step 1 done. The next is about putting those two pieces together. So you would have marked where the end stitch would be in order for the vent to then open. So you need to join those together like so. Now we'll pop some pins in place. So making sure first of all that tailor's tack mark are joined up nicely, like so. And then stitching or pinning, sorry, towards the remaining back seam, as well as down the length of the vent, like so. So first of all, I'm going to come in from the top. So this is probably where the waistband will be. That would be something you'd put on after. You'd need to do the back vent first. And you'd come down to this pivot point here, the tailor's tack point here. And this is the tip, this is the first tip. So let's go there first. So it's a 1.5 seam allowance that I'm using, but obviously yours may vary depending on what seam allowance you prefer. And I'm stitching with a normal stitch length down towards that tailor's tack. Now here I'm going to do a little back stitch, being very careful that I don't go off that stitch line, and then come forward again and then stop where that tailor's tack is. Now I'm going to stay in this position and just quickly glance over to my sewing gauge panel on my machine to find out what the seam allowance is, where my vent finishes. So in this case it's 3.5. It may vary on yours obviously because this is a smaller guide, but what you could do is measure out and mark it down if you prefer. But what I am going to do definitely is increase my stitch length to the biggest the machine will give me, and that's going to then give me a nice tacking stitch for the next tip. So I'm just going to stitch all the way down now using that seam allowance guide, removing my pin as I go, towards what is now the hem line. Again, taking and cutting. So I've got a continuous line of stitching now all the way down the back seam and down the length of the vent. Now what that does is give me a perfect pressing guide for my back vent. So taking the iron and giving that a really good press, like so. Now to finish off the back vent, we need to do some stitching. So what you can see you've got your little tailor's tacks here. You need to stitch this part of the vent down. So you're going to come across in this direction to hold that vent down. So this is where we need to be very, very careful. So taking the needle up, what I would suggest is manually cranking the needle down, and you want to get in between the seam. It's basically almost what you would do in quilting called stitching in the ditch, and that's what we're going to do for a little bit first. So I'm stitching in the ditch towards what is the tailor's tack, leaving the needle down in the fabric, pivoting to the angle. So again, depending on if you can see or not or feel it, you might want to pop a pin so you get an idea of the direction that you're going. So that's the direction of the vent, and I can use that as a gauge now. If I just bring my sewing machine down a bit more, can use that as a gauge now in relation to the direction. And then I'm going to stitch towards that there. I'm going to do a little back stitch, and then I'm going to take my needle up and give myself some tails. So using those tails, what I can then do is thread those back into the garment so they're nice and hidden, rather than cutting close like this, because again you run the risk of kind of that losing your stitch basically. So that would be my extra tip, but for speed I'm not going to do that. So once you've stitched your vent down like so, what you can then do is release this part of the stitching. So as you can see, I've unpicked and released the vent now in the back of my mock-up skirt. So there's one thing left to do before we then continue with the rest of it. 9 times out of 10, your back seam, which is this part here up until that section there, needs to be open, especially if you're going to put something in like a centered zip, for instance. And also it just helps remove bulk, because as you can see, all of the seams are currently on my right hand side. So to finish off, all you need to do is to take your scissors, go in between those 2 seam allowances which are there, and cut towards that stitch. So it's really important that you don't actually cut the stitches, but you cut towards it. And then what that will do is allow that seam to then open up, so you can then continue with whatever next process it is. Like I said, if you're putting in a centered zip, for instance, or you just want to reduce bulk in the area when you get to put your waistband on. But that would be what your back vent looks like at the back. Obviously you need to take out your tailor's tacks, and this is what it would look like in the front. I hope you found my Your Skirt Your Way tips really useful, and it's been an absolute pleasure to spend my day with you today. So enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.